The angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, "What troubles you, Hagar? Do not be afraid." Well, I would like to tell you a story this morning. And, I don't have a costume, and not an appropriate costume. And I can't do accents, so I'm going to have to ask you to use your imagination. I've used a little bit of poetic license, but mostly it comes straight from the Bible. So here goes. When I was a little girl, I remember playing on the banks of the Nile and dreaming about growing up and having a family of my own and never straying very far from my beloved river. But one day, ugly men came and killed my parents and made me go with them. They sold me to this nomadic trader to serve his wife. So I learned their language and I did my best to avoid getting punished. But I never stopped dreaming about my river. I reached puberty as a slave to a woman who could not seem to understand that we were both human beings. I hated her, but I also gradually noticed how sad she was. She didn't have children. And as I compared myself with her, I realized that we were not really so very different. Barren women had no value, just like slaves had no value except what we could gain in the market. And sometimes I'd imagine us both there at the slave market, and I knew that I was young and strong, and I was pretty sure I'd get a better price. Yet the nomadic trader who owned us both seemed to love her in his own way, and he refused to take a second wife, so he had no children. Then one night, I was taken from my duties and washed and perfumed and given expensive clothes to wear. It was nice. It was nice to feel clean and to smell nice, but I wasn't an idiot. I was terrified of where this was heading, and as it turned out, it was heading toward the tent of my master. And the one who led me there was his wife. Then this happened night after night until it became apparent that I was pregnant. And then it stopped and I returned to my ordinary servitude. But as the child grew within me, this inner turmoil also grew. My anger, my feeling of being trapped and hopeless all competed with this new emotion of protection for this child. This turmoil made me impulsive at times and sometimes showed itself in smart comments to the woman who had not been able to conceive a child as I had. And she didn't like that very much, and she dragged me to her husband and demanded that I be punished. I held my breath, and I hoped that he'd be merciful for the sake of the child, his child. But I knew what he was going to say before he said it. "She's your slave, do what you like." And with those words, my troubles multiplied. I was beaten regularly. I was required to do the hardest and most dangerous chores. I was given barely enough food to sustain myself, let alone the little life that was growing inside me. So one night, after the women went to sleep, I snuck out of the camp and ran away. I didn't take anything with me because I didn't own anything. And out there in the wilderness on my own, I had no illusions about my ability to survive. I just knew that death in the wilderness would be preferable to life in this camp. But I found a spring and was grateful that I wouldn't die of thirst while I was waiting to die from hunger. But as I lay there by the spring, I heard a voice. Hagar, slave girl of Sarah, where have you come from? And where are you going? How did this person know my name, and why did he care about where I'd come from and where I was going? But as my eyes met his, I knew that I couldn't lie. I'm running away, I said, from my mistress Sarah. And then this man with the kind face said the hardest words. He said, return to Sarah and submit to her. But I think he must have read my thoughts, because he quickly went on to say, your son will be born, and I will make of him an enormous family. You will be the mother of many more descendants than you can count. You'll call your son Ishmael, because the Lord has heard your story and seen your suffering. As I looked up and I met his eyes again, I suddenly realized that I had seen God. I'd seen God, and yet I survived. And so I returned to Sarah and did nothing to provoke her, so that my son could have a home to be born into. He was born at last, and surprisingly, Abraham agreed to the name of Ishmael. God hears. And so my son grew strong and wild, and the most beautiful creature I had ever seen. And Abraham became attached to him for a while. But one day I noticed a smug expression on my mistress's face, and eventually started to notice the roundness in her tummy. And in due course, Sarah gave birth to a son, and Abraham named him Isaac. For a while, neither Abraham nor Sarah took any notice of Abraham's first son, and I hoped it would stay that way. But Isaac grew, and he learned to walk, and he wandered from his mother's tent, and one day Sarah found him playing with Ishmael. And she snatched him up and took him to Abraham and demanded that I and my son be thrown out of the camp. Isaac must be Abraham's only son. And so, early one morning, Abraham gave me some bread and water and sent me away. And so once again, I was in the wilderness without hope. But this time I couldn't find a spring, and I ran out of water. And Ishmael began to cry, a weak, parched little cry. I didn't want to watch him die, so I put him under a bush and I walked away, just far enough so that I didn't have to see his weak little body. And then, God again. What troubles you, Hagar? Don't be afraid. Return to your child and hold him. He will live and will be the father of a great nation. And God showed me a spring with plenty of water. And so I became a free woman, and my son grew to be a man and to marry a nice Egyptian girl, and have lots of children who all make me so very happy. Abraham and Sarah, on the other hand, well, it seems that they'd been called to produce a family that would restore humanity and heal the world. And starting from parents like that family had a lot to learn. So, they had abused their Egyptian slave girl. And so within a few generations, their family would learn all about slavery in my home country of Egypt. Well, I hope you think that it's illuminating to look at this story from Hagar's perspective, from the perspective of the victim. In recent years in the West, a lot of people have been taking a fresh look at our history from previously unexplored perspectives. By imagining, for example, what colonisation would have felt like from the perspective of the colonised, of the Indigenous peoples, rather than the colonisers. And in the last couple of weeks, some statues around the world have been toppled, as crowds have declared that certain people should no longer be held up as heroes. And I'm quite sure that even in our little congregation, we're going to find that there's a range of opinions on those sorts of actions. And I am not going to suggest that we pull down statues of Abraham, even if we had any. But what I will say is that many of us learned the great stories of the Old Testament when we were children. We learned them in Sunday school. And so the dark and unsavoury aspects of those stories were often overlooked, and we were simply told to look up to these people like Abraham as heroes. And if that's all we do, then we've missed the point of the story. To really make the most of these stories, we need to enter into them from all perspectives. We do need to see Abraham's perspective. We need to look at ourselves as Abraham, waiting decade after decade for God's promise to be fulfilled, wondering if God had really spoken at all or if we were just hallucinating. And we do need to see ourselves as Sarah, feeling the shame of thinking it was our fault that God's purposes seem to have been thwarted, trying to find some other way to make it happen. But we also need to see ourselves as Hagar, as the victims caught up in the sin and faithlessness of others, as the one bearing the consequence of other people's abuse of power. And if we have ever been abused, rejected, or powerless, we can take great comfort in noticing that Hagar seems to be God's favourite character in this story. And if the Abrahams and Sarahs of the world leave us to starve in the wilderness, then we can be sure that God will find us there. And when we look at it that way, we can read Romans 6:1 in a new light. Should we continue in sin in order that grace may abound? Was it okay for Abraham to send Hagar away because God had told him that God would take care of her? Should we allow just injustice to go unchallenged in our lives and in the world because we know that God is on the side of the victim? I hope with Paul you would say, by no means. How can we who have died to sin go on living in it? We have been united with Christ in his death as a victim of injustice. That is the primary place where we enter into the story of the human race, suffering with Jesus, weeping with Hagar, and identifying with all who are exploited and abandoned in our world. And so in that place of tears, may the Lord see you, may the Lord hear you, and may the Lord be with you. Amen.